Hi everyone, there's a theory that English was actually already spoken in England before the Anglo-Saxons arrived. Now this might seem like a completely impossible theory, but it does actually have a coherent basis to it. Now I'm not saying that it's correct, but it's coherent at least. So the idea is that we know from archaeology and from historical records that the southeast of England was extensively inhabited by Belgic tribes, and they settled there from the 2nd century BCE. We know this from archaeology, and also Caesar tells us that that's what happened. Now, the reason why that's so important is to do with the identity of the Belgic tribes. So the Belgic tribes, or the Belgae, were one of the 3 main groups who lived in Gaul. In Caesar's description of Gaul, he divides it into 3 different sections. There was the main part of Gaul, which was the Celtic Gaul, and then in the southwest there was Aquitaine, and that was composed of people who weren't Celts. They were their own thing. They spoke what's called an Aquitanian language. But then to the northeast there were the Belgic tribes, the Belgae. So according to Caesar, these 3 different groups of people were distinct and they spoke different languages. And he specifically explains that the Belgae originated from across the Rhine, in the area of the Germanic tribes. So he suggests that they were Germanic, but they were Germans who had settled in what was considered by that point Gaul. So they weren't actually Celts, they were Germans who were outside the main territory of the Germanic tribes. That's what Caesar's description implies, to some people at least. And so that very naturally, very logically, lends itself to this fascinating thought. Since the Belgae migrated from the continent to Britain before the Roman era, could it be that they took with them a Germanic language, and therefore the tribes in the southeast of Britain weren't actually Celtic tribes, but rather they were Germanic tribes. They were speaking a Germanic language, and that is what then evolved into English. And sure, the Anglo-Saxons migrated there as well in the post-Roman era, but they just added a little bit of modern influence to what was already a Germanic language and that had already been there for several centuries. That's the idea. So the idea is that English doesn't originate with the Anglo-Saxons, but it originates with the Belgae, the Belgic tribes who established themselves in Britain in the Iron Age. Now, I'm sure you'll agree this is a very interesting theory. It seems kind of plausible when we first look at the evidence, but when we look closer at the evidence, does it really stand up to scrutiny? Well, the problem is there are actually lots of serious problems with it. So the Belgae are attested on the continent and in Britain, which is useful because it means we have a lot of data about them. So we look at the tribal names, we look at the place names in their territory, the topography, we look at coin inscriptions with their personal names on them, we look at outside references to the kings, to people, to the names of different groups, and we see that they are overwhelmingly Celtic, not Germanic. There are some Germanic influences, some Germanic names, but the overwhelming majority of these names are Celtic. One scholar tried to justify the fact that the tribal names are almost all Celtic by suggesting that this is simply because the Romans, who are our main source for these tribal names, were told about these tribes by Celtic informants. So the Celts, who were telling the Romans about these tribes, referred to them by the names that they called them by. So they referred to them by Celtic names, not their own native Germanic names, and that's why the names that the Romans referred to them as are Celtic rather than Germanic. Now, to me, with the greatest respect, that is an absolutely absurd attempt at a justification for several reasons. One, if that were the case, that there were Celtic informants who were informing the Romans of these tribes, and therefore that's why the Romans knew them by Celtic names instead of Germanic names, then we would expect to see the same thing among the actual Germanic tribes of the continent. In fact, we'd expect to see that even more than in Britain, because at least the Romans were actually active in Britain physically. They took over the area, they conquered it, whereas they never totally conquered the territory of the Germanic tribes. So they were far more familiar with the British tribes than they were with the Germanic tribes, so they would have had a far greater need for Celtic informants in the case of the Germanic tribes of the continent. So if these Celtic informants were referring to these foreign tribes by Celtic names, then that would apply far more to the Germanic tribes, who were more distant from the Romans, than the British tribes with whom the Romans had direct contact. They didn't need Celtic informants. Also, the tribes that the Romans had the most direct contact with in Britain were the ones of the southeast, not the ones further afield. So if the ones in the southeast, who were the Belgic tribes, if they were Germanic, then the Romans didn't have Celtic informants, they would have had Germanic informants. So actually we would expect to see the opposite. We would expect to see these Germanic tribes being referred to by their Germanic names, and we would expect to see the non-Germanic tribes further afield in Wales and Scotland and the West Country being referred to by Germanic names. So the idea that they had Celtic informants who were informing them of what the rest of Britain was like, and that's why the Romans were aware of all these Celtic tribal names but not Germanic ones, it's just completely incoherent as an explanation for why these tribes in the southeast are called by Celtic tribal names rather than Germanic ones. And also this explanation about Celtic informants does nothing to explain away the evidence about Celtic personal names among the kings of these tribes, because obviously the names wouldn't be translated. We don't see that in other examples of interactions between Romans and other non-Roman tribes. It just doesn't happen. And also we have evidence from the coins that these kings made themselves that these names really were the names that the Romans recorded them as having. So there's no doubt that they really did have Celtic personal names, and there's no plausible way of explaining away all those Celtic tribal names. However, what about the fact that Caesar does make a distinction between those three groups of Gaul, the Aquitanian tribes, the Gauls, and the Belgae? What's the explanation for that? Does that prove that the Belgic tribes didn't speak a Celtic language? So even if it wasn't Germanic, at least a non-Celtic language was spoken in southeast Britain? Well, actually it's not that simple. For one thing, the evidence from personal names and tribal names, the actual inscriptions made by these tribes, clearly trumps Caesar's own personal observations. But also, when we look to the words of Strabo, who wasn't writing too long after Caesar, we find what's kind of an explanation about Caesar's words. In a passage which closely reflects Caesar's description of Gaul, Strabo says, "Some, as we know, have divided it into three parts, calling its inhabitants Aquitani, Belgae, and Celtae. The Aquitani, they said, are wholly different, not only in respect to their language, but also in respect to their physique, more like the Iberians than the Galatae." That's another word for the Celts, by the way. While the rest of the inhabitants are Galatic in appearance, although not all speak the same language, but some make slight variations in their languages. Now this passage is very important because it confirms that the Aquitani were completely different from the other two groups of Gaul, while those other two groups were not substantially different from each other. Regarding specifically their language, he says that they don't all speak the same language, but some make slight variations in their languages. So in other words, the differences between their languages are just slight variations. They're not completely different languages. More like, I suppose we could say, different dialects. And that follows what we find in the archaeological record, in these inscriptions, and also from the personal and place names. The language of the Belgic tribes is just another form of Celtic, very similar but slightly different to the language of the Gallic Celts. So basically it seems that Caesar was just exaggerating the differences between these two groups because he was actually summing up all three groups. And since they did all have at least slightly different languages, or in the case of the Aquitani, a completely different language, he just summed them all up by saying that they each had their own language. Whereas in reality, as we know from these contemporary inscriptions and also from Strabo, we can see that actually the differences were just slight and that they were just basically different dialects of the same language. They were both Celtic languages. So what does this mean for the issue of English, the English language? Did it arrive in Britain centuries before the Anglo-Saxons? Was it already spoken in Britain from as early as the Iron Age? Well, the evidence would indicate that no, it wasn't. The only basis for this idea is the idea that the Belgic tribes spoke a Germanic language, but there is no substantial evidence for that. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that they were Celtic speakers predominantly. So that indicates that the southeast of Britain really did speak a Celtic language, just as everyone has always believed. Now here's another question for you. When did the famous Herod the Great really die? Well, if you'd like to find out the answer, then come back next time for my next video.